This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. We've heard these words before because the same speech was heard by God the Father when Jesus Christ was baptized in the Jordan River by St. John. There's a slight difference, a significant difference in the words of God the Father on this particular occasion of the transfiguration of his Son. After identifying him as his Son, he then gives a very clear and explicit command. Listen to him. Listen to him. Why? Well, because Jesus Christ is the Word through whom all things were made. This is the God who made us, who knows us inside and out, and has nothing at heart except our well-being, our flourishing, our happiness, our life with him in his heaven. And so I think we can all concede the point that just perhaps Jesus might be the one we want to listen to in this regard, because he has something to say, things we need to hear. I want to explore two aspects of what it means to listen. And in this case, specifically, to listen to Jesus Christ. The first aspect of listening is one that is the most obvious. That we use our ears to hear what someone else has to say. But there's a nuance in there, right? Because our ears hear all kinds of things involuntarily. Listening requires intention. You have to want to know what the other person is saying. And this kind of brings us to just a little brief lesson in etymology regarding the English word obedience. The word obedience comes from the Latin verb obedire. Obedire. And what it quite literally means is to be inclined to listen. Because that's the very essence of obedience. You have to know and want to know what Jesus Christ has to say and be ready and willing to put those words into practice. Because again, we are talking about the God who made us. It's that clear. It's that simple. But then there's another aspect of listening. And I would suggest that this aspect of listening is actually the most important. And it's more or less the seedbed that is required for the active listening with our ears that bears fruit in obedience. And this is the listening with our heart, not our ears. And to begin to listen to God with our heart requires something that is altogether simple, but yet for us seems altogether difficult. In order to listen to God with our heart and to speak with Him with our heart, we have to learn an entirely new language, which can be daunting at first, especially if you have ever studied a foreign language. But at the same time, we do have to understand that for any relationship, for any degree of intimacy between two persons, there has to be effective communication. And that effective communication is wholly dependent on using a language that is common to both. And this is true with our relationship with God, and learning this language is necessary for deepening our friendship and our intimacy with Him. Now to the good news. This language is not complicated. In fact, it's the easiest language you'll ever learn because you don't have to memorize one word, none at all. Because the language of God is silence. And that's what makes it daunting and complicated and difficult for us. But it is a language that we can learn with a little practice. Where do we get this notion? How do we know that silence is the very language of God, with which He communicates with us as one friend to another, as St. Teresa of Avila would say? Well, I think all we have to do is turn our attention to the first book of Kings and look at an episode in the life of our friend Elijah. You may recall the narrative where Elijah is in a cave, and just outside that cave, a ferocious wind passes by. And then there's an earthquake. And then there is a storm of fire. And we're told that in none of these phenomena did Elisha detect the presence of God. He was found in none of these. But then, we are told there was this still whispering voice. It was barely perceptible, yet in it, Elisha recognized the presence of God. And in the presence of God, he took his mantle, covered his face, and went and stood at the entrance of the cave. In the Hebrew language, the still whispering voice is quite literally Kol Demama Deka, which if we were to translate it more literally is rendered the voice of sheer silence. And let that sink in. The voice of sheer silence. This is the language with God that we need to grow habituated to, that we need to learn. We look at our prayers and we're accustomed to all kinds of vocal prayers. The Our Father, the Hail Mary. You can think of things like the Rosary, There is our daily meditation on the sacred scriptures, or from our favorite devotional, there might be meditations that we enjoy. And we find that in our prayer, in our relationship with God, we're constantly having to work. We're constantly having to do something. We're constantly having to say something. Otherwise, we're thinking, I'm not praying. And I'm not diminishing all these things. These things are all great, good, and necessary. But there's one thing missing. And that's what it is that our heart is truly thirsting for. That which our heart is truly hungering for. That deep intimacy in friendship with God that we truly long for. St. Teresa of Avila, talking about our vocal prayers and the prayers of meditation, uses this image. She says that a person who prays has a desire to water the garden of their soul. And so they take up a bucket and they go to the well. They lower the bucket. They draw the water. They raise the bucket. They take the bucket. They run back to the garden and they water it. And they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And at the end of the day, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. And our heart knows it. And it's begging for rest from all of its labors. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. And so in learning to speak the language of God in our prayer, we begin to introduce ourselves to the possibility of not running to the well with a bucket, but allowing God to bring the water to us. In modern language, by means of a pump. So we don't have to make so many trips back and forth. And I know this is all theoretical and abstract and good. And so there has to be some kind of a practical application, and there certainly is. And so let's say, take for example the individual who prays their rosary every day. Terrific. Because you know what you're doing in your rosary? You're praying your vocal prayers. Wonderful. You're meditating on the mysteries of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Wonderful. There's also something we also know. It's work. And quite frankly, and if you're honest with yourself, don't you begin the rosary looking forward more to the end than to what takes place in the middle? And so here's my suggestion. Slow down. And what do I mean by that? I mean that after each decade, after praying and meditating on each mystery, stop. And simply rest in the silence of the presence of God and listen to Him with your heart for 30 seconds. That's all. That's all. To recollect yourself in the presence of God, not by straining, not by force of concentration, not by any effort of our own. not expecting a feeling, a sensation, or an experience. To simply be. And lovingly aware that you are in the presence of the God who made you. And open your heart and listen with the purity and nakedness of faith. You see, doing so begins to signal to God. It begins to signal to Him that you're responding to the desire He placed in your heart for something more, for a deeper friendship, a deeper sense of intimacy. With regards to recollection, in general, being aware of the presence of God, in your prayers, these moments of silence are just punctuation marks in all of our activity to be wholly and completely receptive. And St. Teresa of Avila knows exactly what she's talking about because she admits that for 20 years she ran back and forth from the well over and over and over, day after day after day, and admits that until she discovered recollection, she never knew satisfaction in her life of prayer. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's always been there. And it's not just the rosary, it's in our Lectio Divina, in our prayer with the sacred scriptures, or again, as I said, your favorite book of meditations. It's all good and fine, to engage in the vocal and mental work of prayer, but also to take time to simply pause and listen with your heart in the silence of the presence of God. And then He will take over. The period become a little longer. Maybe it'll be a little shorter. There's no expectations. And having said that, is that, when in our daily prayers, we never show up without a bucket. We need the bucket. But you also need to open ourselves and be receptive to God bringing the water we're thirsting for to us. It can be awkward at first, granted, because we're learning a new language. And all of you are parents. We're children, we're infants, and they began to speak for the first time. Did you ridicule them? Did you walk away? You thought it was adorable. Absolutely adorable. How much more God the Father, the God who made you, sees you beginning to speak His language so that you can communicate with Him and enter into that deeper, more satisfying, more abiding relationship with Him that your heart is thirsting for.